Hey there, this is Françoise. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to give you my best tips for beautiful and realistic watercolor portraits with a step-by-step watercolor nose demo. I find that the nose is the hardest part in a portrait. It's easy to mess it up with all the shadows, and even more so with watercolors. I painted this one from a reference photo of model Gigi Hadid, and you can see it's pretty close to the original. So I'm going to tell you what I did to get to this point, and most importantly, what common mistakes you should be watching for when you paint or draw one. I'm going to go over my supplies as I get into this, but if you need more detail, you will find links to all of them in the description of this video. Let's dive right into the tips. My first tip for a realistic nose is to use the right type of paper. I use 100% cotton watercolor paper, cold pressed, because it works well with a wet and wet technique, which I'm going to use quite a bit to paint this nose. Cold pressed paper is a little bit textured, but it works well with portraits. I have used brands like Arches, Winsor & Newton, and Constant L'Héritage, and they all work really well for portraits. If all you have is wood pulp paper, which is the cheaper type of watercolor paper, you can very well try my tips, but chances are it will be a lot harder to get the results I'm getting here. Wood pulp paper absorbs less water, so the paint dries fast and increases the chance that you get blotches, blooms, and something that doesn't look smooth in the end, according to my personal experience. My second tip for a realistic nose is to make sure the sketch is as good as can be to begin with. For a nose, the sketch doesn't need to be intricate. All you need is to lightly mark the nostrils, the edge of each nose wing, and the nose bridge to actually get a sense of where it stops and how wide it should be. Notice how I'm not drawing lines all the way up. It's one thing that's quite common when people draw or paint noses. They emphasize the shape with a line on each side, and it doesn't look natural because there is no lines there, just shadows. This is why I don't do it. The few lines I did draw here, however, serve as landmarks more than anything else, and I will be careful to avoid harsh lines there too. Marking the nostrils is the bare minimum to locate where the nose should be and how wide. One thing I didn't mention is how I sharpen my pencil before I start sketching for more precision. It's better not to press too hard with it, and if the lines are too strong, it's better to fade them a bit with a knited eraser like this here. After that, you're good to go. My third tip for a realistic nose is to use the right paint brushes. Today I'll be using my Silver Brush Black Velvet brush because it's pointy and can get me details, but I can also paint larger chunks with it. And I also grabbed another brush, a round one, to fade any excess paint with clean water and avoid any harsh lines in my work. If you don't have these two paintbrushes, it really doesn't matter. All this matters is to have one that can help you paint within small areas precisely, like the nostrils, and another one, preferably round in shape, to fade harsh lines. You could get by with any brushes, but having the right type certainly helps. My fourth tip for a realistic nose is to mix skin tones that look real, not too pink or brown for instance. We have all painted or seen those unrealistic tones before, and that's a common mistake. And make sure to use a light, an average, and a dark version of the skin tone you come up with. My skin tone, I feel, was a bit yellowish here, but the reference is like that, so I'm fine with it. You can see here I'm mixing yellow, red, and a little bit of blue to get a flesh tone, and then I test it on a piece of paper with more or less water to make sure it will look accurate as a skin tone. Talking about skin tones, they're achieved mostly by mixing the three primaries I mentioned, but I will link a helpful video of mine here that will help you get the skin tones you want if you feel the need to look into this matter a bit more. My fifth tip for a realistic nose and face in general is to use the right technique. I'm going to share here what is working well with me. I like to use the wet and wet technique at the beginning, which means I wet the paper. I apply my paint to have a base. This base should be very light, so make sure to add lots of water in the mix you use for the first layer. I let it dry and I layer again, adding darker paint in what I see are darker areas in my reference photo. Working in layers using the wet and wet technique at first helps me shape the nose roughly by keeping some areas light and darkening others. It also helps avoiding harsh lines. Go in with a wet on dry technique right away would leave much less room for mistakes, and it would probably make the painting look less real because the paints wouldn't dry as light as when they're mixed with lots of water, like in the wet and wet technique. So you need less layers, and the whole thing would look less real in my opinion, since depth and realism are created by multiple layers and a good contrast. So once I have a rough but close shape, I can start working more on the details. For that, I start using the wet on dry technique. I use this technique to help define key areas like the nostrils, for instance, or the edges of the nose wings, since my nose is only a rough shape now. I also use the wet on dry technique to refine the general shape in whichever area I want to. I use my second brush to fade any harsh edges I could be making in the process. Remember, we want to avoid harsh lines, except for the shadow the nose is making on the skin in the bottom left part. You can observe this in this specific photo as well, and that's how you know it's okay. To fade an edge effectively elsewhere in this painting, you will need to be quick and grab that extra brush before your edge dries. The brush must be clean and just damp. To sum this part up, use the wet and wet technique to place your highlights, shadows, and average tones, and when you have a rough shape, work on bits of it with the wet on dry technique, starting with the nostrils since they are a good landmark to work from. My sixth tip, I talked about it previously, but I want to emphasize it, is to build realism with layers. This is why you see me apply color, let dry, apply more, and so on. Not only this is effective to make sure and avoid the mistake of painting a shadow somewhere it shouldn't be because we're working slowly, but having several layers in your painting, and that goes for any type of watercolor painting, is building depth, and that will show. Each layer must help you either fix a mistake with a darker layer or just refine a spot to make it look more like it is in the photo. A lot of times, portraits are painted with just 1 or 2 layers and they look very bland, lifeless, not realistic. This tip of working with layers and the previous one of using the right techniques go hand in hand with my 7th tip, which is to work from light to dark. For that, use one mix to which you add more or less water. The first layers will be very light, there will be a lot of water. And as you go, you can start narrowing things down with darker areas, which means there's going to be less water in your mix. More paint. This avoids many mistakes, and it's important for something like a nose, since shadows placed in the wrong place could change how a person looks completely. Having them in the right place and using the wet and wet technique, with the first layers to make nice blends, then a wet and damp brush with a wet on dry touch-ups to keep blending them in the rest of the skin is going to give you the realistic look you're going for. My 8th tip is to be aware of where the shadows usually are on the nose, or at least and even preferably look at your photo to identify where they are on this specific nose. Usually shadows are located on either side of the nose with an emphasis in that little crease on the sides of the nose wings. It makes sense since the area there is a hollow one, just like the nostrils are. Then there's usually a light shadow all around the tip of the nose. That's how we tell a person's nose is pointing forward when they're just in front of us, if you think about it. Again, no lines anywhere. It's just about where things are curving inwards, where they're sticking out, and where the light is hitting the nose, etc. My 9th tip for a realistic nose is to glaze a pinkish tone on top of your skin tone to make it look nicer. This depends on you and how you feel about your skin tone. I told you before I found mine a bit yellowish, so I added a light wash of pink on the whole thing to infuse a little bit more life in there. Glazing means I just added a coat of another color on top of everything I've done till now. I add this coat of paint when everything is dry as a finishing touch, kind of, and I add a very light mix of it. I wouldn't want the skin to look too pink now. My 10th tip for a realistic nose is to add highlights with white gouache. You can also use a gel pen, but it's usually a lot more obvious. Or you could use a white pastel pencil or a white colored pencil. These last two, I feel, show a lot, especially on my cold pressed paper. It looks grainy, not smooth at all, so I prefer white gouache. Plus, if you make a mistake, white gouache is much easier to fix. It goes away easily with water. What I like to do is wet the area where the highlight is, add my paint and let it spread a bit and dry. I add more of it if it looks too light. You can add it wet on dry if you prefer. I like to wet the surface beforehand as it looks less strong. I feel like it's more subtle. That's also one thing with realism. Keep things subtle, and the addition of all these is what makes for a great painting. Highlights on the nose vary depending on where the light hits the nose, but most of the time it's located on the bridge and on the tip of the nose. you know everything about how I proceed to make my portraits look realistic. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and share it on social media. And if you haven't already and are interested in my tips and tutorials, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching and see you next time.